Now, this is another episode of U.S. History by Lou, and sometimes I take a look at sex and scandal and sleaze and some of the good things that have happened in U.S. history as well. And today our topic is going to be basically competitive authoritarianism, kind of a big word and a big topic, but one we need to be very much aware of as we move forward. So as you listen today and watch, I want you to ask yourself three questions. First of all, is this something new, something we've never dealt with in the history of in the U.S., or has there been some version of it there all along? Second question is, how did it happen? If we have something new like authoritarianism creeping into our life, how did it come about? And then finally, another question, are there ways to turn it around if we're not happy with the way things are in this country? So ask yourself those three questions, and so we'll take a look at this very important topic. I need to pay tribute to two authors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They've written a variety of things over time about authoritarianism, and they are really excellent scholars and experts on this field. They've written a book called How Democracies Die in 2018, another one in 2020, and they have done some other lecturing and so forth, and they have a brand new book out that's as well dealing with the same subject from a little different point of view. And so if you really want to get into in-depth, go and get a hold of their book and their materials and listen to them when you hear them on various media being interviewed. A little bit about the problem that has occurred. When they founded the country back in 1787, and that's when the Constitution was written, there was never the word democracy in the Constitution, nor previously had it been in the Declaration of Independence or in 1991 when we have a Bill of Rights, no word about democracy. Founding fathers weren't too keen on it, actually. They really didn't fully trust the common man. However, by the time we reached the time of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, we have become a nation practicing democracy. We have, during the 19th century, a relatively weak executive. Congress was the main source of power, and that's the way the Constitution was intended to be used. With the advent of a complicated society, as our complex nation grew and industrialization took place, in the 20th century dawn, we have a strong executive in Teddy Roosevelt. And I think I could submit that all of the executives who have been president since then have been relatively strong in varying degrees. Beginning, however, with Richard Nixon, but especially during the time of Ronald Reagan, there's a new philosophy expounded called unitary executive, where really very little power should belong to Congress. It should all be vested in the executive. Now, various legal scholars have looked at this and said, no, 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 that's not what the Constitution is all about. That's not what they said in 1787. And they preach an originalism. They go back and look and find out what the real intent was. I submit that the unitary executive concept is very dangerous because what it can lead to is competitive authoritarianism, which is what we're struggling with in this country right now. Are we going to be a competitive authoritarian country? And some people think we're already there. A big part of this is patrimonialism, and later I'm going to do a whole session just on patrimonialism. And that is basically loyalty and cronyism. It's naming people to offices and leadership roles that have no experience in it. They have no depth of knowledge. They're like Hegseth, who's our Secretary of Defense. He was a political commentator on a television network, and now he heads the Department of Defense. It's cronyism. Now, inevitably, this will lead to incompetence because when people don't know how to do their job, they're going to start to fail in various ways. And when you start to fail, you're also going to begin to see more and more out and out corruption of various kinds. Now, I don't know if it's there now, but I guarantee you there will be corruption in the current presidential administration, probably big time. All of this can later lead to a decline of the nation. It puts us really in a very fragile position Now, can it be reversed? Yes, it can. Very hard to do, however. Elections can begin to do this because in order to really institutionalize competitive authoritarianism forever, you need to have a long period of time in which you keep changing the rules and intensifying the rules. And so elections in 2026 and 2028 will be very important in this regard. Well, I would submit that in this country right now, we have what I would call a 5-alarm fire. It's absolutely the most dangerous time that we've been in, and we all need to be on deck to help put out the fire in any way we can, because American democracy may be stolen away from you. And I would submit, and it happened or is happening when you weren't even looking, were you? And so we live in perilous times, and it's up to each one of us to make sure we maintain the country. So, little definition. Full authoritarianism might be defined as totalitarianism that we saw so much of in the beginning of the 20th century with Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and all of the others. But this is social control with strict obedience to the authority of a state or organization, maintaining and enforcing control through the use of oppressive measures. Very dictatorial, highly hierarchical. Now, on the other hand, what is competitive authoritarianism? Formal democratic institutions exist. They're still there and are the means they have used to gain power. But once they gain power, then the incumbents abuse them. They have a significant advantage over their opponents. They are democratic in appearance, but authoritarian in nature. Democratic institutions exist in form, but not in substance. And the electoral, judicial, media, and other institutions are heavily skewed in favor of the current power holders. Such regimes are competitive. Opposition parties use democratic institutions to contest seriously for power, but they're not democratic because the playing field is heavily skewed in favor of the incumbents. Competition is thus real. Yes, there's competition, but it's so inherently unfair that nothing can ever be changed. Abusing the rules. Incumbents use bribery, co-optation, and persecution to harass critics, much more so than is ever found in democracies. Democratic contests are possible. Hybrid regimes sometimes exist, and they are in transition. A combination of democratic and authoritarian elements. Maybe they're moving more towards authoritarian over time. There's a proliferation of them that took place after the Cold War, and I would submit they're not inevitable. There are ways around this. We don't have to have it always happen. Unlike the single party or military autocracies that predominated during the Cold War, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, and so forth, Zimbabwe, elsewhere, governments were competitive in that opposition forces used democratic institutions to contest vigorously and at times successfully for power. Nevertheless, these regimes were not democratic. Government critics suffered harassment, arrest, and in some cases, violent attacks, and electoral fraud. Unfair media access and abuse of state resources skewed the playing field heavily in favor of incumbents. The challengers could never win. We call such regimes competitive authoritarianism. Authoritarian. Competitive authoritarian regimes proliferated during the post-Cold War period. In 1995, at least 35 regimes were competitive authoritarian, which exceeded the number of democracies among developing and post-communist countries. An organization called the Varieties of Democracy Institute had a report in 2023 highlighting that the number of countries experiencing autocratization has risen from 13 to 42 between 2002 and 2022, which is the highest figure they had ever measured. The end of the Cold War posed a fundamental challenge to authoritarianism. Single party and military dictatorships collapsed throughout post communist Eurasia, Africa, and much of Asia and Latin America. At the same time, the formal architecture of democracy, particularly multi-party elections, diffused widely across the globe. Transitions didn't always lead to democracy. In much of Africa, former Soviet Union, and in parts of Central and Southeastern Europe, East Asia, and the Americas, new regimes combined electoral competition with varying degrees of authoritarianism. The 35 competitive authoritarian regimes were examined in a 2010 book, Competitive Authoritarianism by Levitsky and Zyblat, that I mentioned a little bit ago. Hybrid regimes followed diverging paths. 15 democratized, 6 democratized, but later regressed into usually competitive authoritarianism, and 4 slid into full-scale authoritarianism, and 10 remain continuously competitive authoritarian. But as competitive authoritarianism has broken down in some countries, it has emerged in others. Some regimes, such as Guinea, Kazakhstan, and Uganda, liberalized from dictatorial to competitive authoritarian rule. Others, as in Bolivia, Hungary, the Philippines, Turkey, and Venezuela, decayed from democracy into competitive authoritarianism. Venezuela has since crossed the line to full authoritarianism. Overall, the number of competitive authoritarian regimes has remained relatively steady over the last quarter century. Whereas there were probably 35 competitive authoritarian regimes in the 90 to 95 period, the number was 32 in 2019. It's useful that we compare regimes. So here we have a little bit of a chart, and it's going to compare democracy, competitive authoritarianism, and full authoritarianism or totalitarianism. We're going to talk about the status of the core democratic institutions, the status of the opposition, and the level of uncertainty. In a democracy, it's systematically respected, widely viewed as the only route to power. Competitive authoritarianism, it exists, are meaningful but systematically violated in favor of the incumbent, widely viewed as a primary route to power, and a non-existent or reduced to facade status, not viewed as a viable route to power in a totalitarian state. This opposition in a democracy competes on more or less equal footing with the incumbent. In competitive authoritarianism, the major opposition is legal and can compete openly, but is significantly disadvantaged by an incumbent abuse. In full authoritarian or totalitarian, major opposition is outright banned or largely underground or in exile, so you can't even see them. In a democracy, everything is uncertain, so you don't know how the next election is going to turn out. You don't know who your next leader is going to wind up being. In competitive authoritarianism, it's lower than democracy, but higher than full authoritarianism. And in full authoritarianism, low uncertainty. In other words, everybody knows pretty much what's going to happen. Putin is going to be in power tomorrow, the next day, the next week, the next year. Nothing really changes. You perhaps remember the boiled frog metaphor or syndrome, often quoted. And the idea is if you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will, of course, frantically try to clamber out. It'll jump out. It'll get out of the hot water because it burns them. On the other hand, supposedly, if you place it gently in a pot of tepid water, turn the heat on low, it will float there quite placidly, just enjoying the warm, gentle environment. As the water gradually heats up, the frog will sink into a tranquil stupor, exactly like one of us in a hot bath, and before long, with a smile on its face, it will unresistingly allow itself to be boiled to death. So the metaphor is that when we have change taking place, like competitive authoritarianism, sometimes it creeps up on us in a way we don't know what's happening. And so before we realize what's happening, it's too late, and we are boiled as frogs. So what's the authoritarians' playbook? First of all, they weaponize fear. They get people terrified of them, especially people who've got to get reelected. They undermine the institutions, the very things we've come to depend on for guaranteeing our safety and good order. They exploit religion for their own purposes. They target outsiders. They make everybody into somebody else, because if there's somebody else, you can attack them because they're different. They divide and conquer. They get us arguing with one another. They rewrite history to their own advantage. They don't depend on the facts. They simply rewrite history as they think it should be. And they consistently erode the truth. The truth is not important in the authoritarian playbook. Historically speaking, the authoritarian playbook is always the same. Their ultimate goal is to consolidate power, and they always use the same time-tested techniques. How does it work? First of all, they start by attacking the free press. Press is dangerous in a real democracy, but we need them. This is just a way to weaken the media's ability to hold the ruler accountable. You can see this dynamic at play when Trump calls any negative coverage of his administration fake news and threatens to take away the media's credentials, as it recently tried to do with the AP network. They try to blame the country's problems on minorities or other vulnerable populations as scapegoats, like transsexuals or gay citizens. This gives the ruler a way to validate people's concerns while redirecting their anger towards a specific ethnic group. If people start protesting or revolting, they will blame the dissent on foreigners or paid protesters. This usually gives a ruler's justification to use force or to strengthen the internal police forces. Very dangerous. Next, they try to weaken judicial checks on power. They publicly discredit judges or the judicial system, defunding departments that investigate internal criminal activity and working to remove people from powerful positions that are now loyal to the regime or its ruler. Which leads us to the value of loyalty. Authoritarians will always reward loyalty over competence, because they fear a system that holds them to the same ethical and legal standard as everyone else. This is why you see very unqualified people running departments that they shouldn't be. They have no experience, they have no depth, they have no knowledge in order to run something, and there they are making major decisions. And that's even more difficult as we become a complicated society like ours has become. Under an authoritarian system, loyalty is more valuable than knowledge or skill. A lot of these dynamics are already happening in the United States. And if we're not careful, the U.S. can slip into a modern version of authoritarianism where elections can and do happen, but they have no power to yield any type of social or political change. The good news is that humanity has had plenty of practice defeating authoritarian leaders. The one thing that works surprisingly well is non-violent resistance. Non-violent resistance. Studies show that between 1900 and 2006, campaigns of non-violent civil resistance were twice as successful as violent campaigns in defeating authoritarian leaders around the world. Nonviolent resistance movements are especially effective. They make it harder for the regime to justify using violence on its own people. This is important. Studies also show that no government can withstand the challenge of 3.5% of its population. Studies also show that no government can withstand the challenge of 3.5% of its population. So getting to that mass of people is the objective. So what can you do? Authoritarians thrive on popular fear and collective resignation. Most powerful thing we can do is to participate in resistance campaigns that are peaceful and non-violent. Movements like Indivisible, and Indivisible is a great organization, and it provides tools for people to peacefully resist things that they disagree with so violently. Or participating in campaigns by the ACLU are good places to start. And you can get on the mailing list for Indivisible and find out what they're up to if you wish to do so. Indivisible.com, I think. Democracy is more fragile than we think. We must use these time-tested ways to defeat authoritarianism before it's too late. The facade that fools us Competitive and authoritarian regimes are distinguished from full authoritarian in that constitutional channels exist through which opposition groups compete in a meaningful way for executive power. Elections are held regularly and opposition parties are not legally barred from contesting them. Opposition activity is above ground. Opposition parties can open offices, recruit candidates, and organize campaigns, and politicians are rarely exiled or imprisoned. In short, democratic procedures are sufficiently meaningful for opposition groups to take them seriously as arenas through which to contest for power. What distinguishes competitive authoritarianism from democracy, however, is that incumbent abuse of the state violates at least one of three defining attributes of democracy. Important. Free elections. We must hold free elections. We must guarantee free elections. Remember that even in the middle of the Civil War, in the middle of World War II, we still held elections in this country. Free elections are important. Broad protection of civil liberties. The right to due process and the rule of law must be protected. The guarantees in the First, the Fifth, and the 14th Amendment in particular. And a reasonable level playing field where you can have an advantage. Well, civil liberties are so very important. And in a democracy, they include a broad range, including rights of free speech and association, a free press. All of these are broadly protected. We have the First, the Fifth, and in particularly the 14th Amendment to thank for guaranteeing that these things are in place. Although these rights may be violated, such violations are infrequent and do not seriously hinder the opposition's capacity to challenge incumbents. In closed regimes, basic civil liberties generally either do not exist or exist on paper, but are so systematically violated that citizens, civic and opposition groups, and media are not even minimally protected from state abuse. For example, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. As a result, much opposition activity takes place either underground or in exile. The difference? In competitive authoritarian regimes, basic civil liberties are formally guaranteed and to some extent protected in actual practice. Independent media exist, and civic and opposition groups are able to operate above ground, opening offices, holding public meetings and demonstrations, and criticizing the government in the media. Civil liberties are frequently violated. Opposition politicians, independent judges, journalists, human rights activists, and other government critics are subject to harassment, arrest, and in some cases, violent attacks. Although civil liberties violations in competitive authoritarian regimes are not systematic or severe enough to force opposition underground or into exile, they clearly exceed what is permissible in a real and genuine democracy. An uneven playing field is necessary for competitive authoritarians. They want a highly uneven playing field, and often they don't even know that the field is uneven because you can't see it so easily, but it's there. Where to draw the line between acceptable incumbent advantage, because it seems logical, incumbents would have some advantage just because they already have the position, and truly uneven playing fields is a difficult one, hard for us to know what's what. State institutions are widely abused for partisan ends. The incumbent party is systematically favored at the expense of the opposition, and the opposition's ability to organize and compete in elections is seriously handicapped. Three aspects of an uneven playing field are of particular importance: the access to resources, the access to media, and access to the law. Access to resources. Incumbents use the state to create or maintain resource disparities that hinder the opposition's ability to compete. Incumbents use state resources while denying other parties access to those resources. In a few cases, this state financing has actually been made legal. Often executive branch make use of secret funds to finance incumbents, and they may also make systematic use of the state's infrastructure. including buildings, vehicles, communication equipment, and personnel for electoral campaigns. Incumbents may use the state to monopolize access to private sector finance. They may use discretionary control over credit, licenses, state contracts, and other resources to enrich themselves via party-owned enterprises. It's all sometimes only thinly away from being an all-out criminal endeavor. Access to the media is limited. It may even be denied. The most important disparities exist in access to electronic media, television and radio, combined with highly biased and partisan coverage. In many Cold War regimes, the state maintained a monopoly over television and most, if not all, radio broadcasting. Sometimes independent newspapers and magazines circulated freely, but were often confined to a small urban elite. In poor, predominantly rural societies, for example, much of Africa, only a tiny fraction of the population even read newspapers. In such cases, if radio and television are in the hands of the state and state-run channels are biased and opposition forces are effectively denied access to the media. So they don't even get a chance to get their story out to the people. Access to the law, the courts, electoral authorities, and other nominally independent arbiters of the rules of the game are not only controlled by incumbents via packing, blackmail, bribery, or intimidation. In electoral, judicial, or other critical disputes, agencies that are designed to act as referees rule systematically in favor of incumbents. That's why we need a very independent judiciary in this country. Incumbent manipulation of the legal system may affect political competition in several ways. Where the judiciary is solidly under control of the governing party, the government may violate democratic procedure with immunity. Incumbents may engage in legal repression or the discretionary use of legal instruments such as tax, libel, or defamation laws as a weapon against opponents or the media, and they can so tie up people in defending themselves that they can never mount a real opposition. Incumbents pack judiciaries, electoral commissions, and other nominally independent arbiters and manipulate via blackmail, bribery, or intimidation. Legal and other state agencies that are designed to act as referees rule systematically in favor of the incumbents. This allows incumbents to engage in illicit acts, including violations of democratic procedure, with impunity. And the more often they get away with it, the more likely they are to repeat their abuse of the system. It also ensures that critical electoral, legal, or other disputes will be resolved in the incumbent's favor. There are paths to authoritarianism. Competitive authoritarian regimes followed three distinct paths. The first is democratization, or the establishment of free and fair elections, broad protection of civil liberties, and a level playing field. If you'll remember, when the Soviet Union disintegrated in the first couple, 3-4 years after that, there actually were truly free and fair elections, broad protection of civil liberties, and a relatively level playing field. But then it gradually drifted. Democratization may be overseen by authoritarian governments. The second outcome is unstable authoritarianism. Subsequent governments do not democratize. And Russia is one of the examples where gradually, 1 year at a time, Putin has gathered more power to himself. They make changes. Successors inherit a skewed playing field and politicized state institutions, which they use to weaken and/or disadvantage their opponents. The third outcome is stable authoritarianism. Authoritarian incumbents remain in power for at least 3 presidential parliamentary terms following the establishment of competitive authoritarian rule. So if in fact we have now moved or are moving to competitive authoritarian rule in the United States, the election in 2026 and 2028 are all that more important, because that could deny them the opportunity to institutionalize and consolidate their power in subsequent years, because it takes a number of years to truly take over a country. Free media still exists under competitive authoritarianism, but self-censors to avoid angering the regime or is available only to liberal elites. The New York Times, which is supposedly one of the great independent journal sources in this country, does both when it uses euphemistic headlines to describe the outrages of the administration and puts its content behind a paywall. The rest of the media available to the masses and the most widely seen are all effectively controlled by the government, especially true in places like Hungary, where approximately 80% of the media is controlled by the government or government-aligned oligarchs. In the end, it creates a system where the opposition party can run whatever candidates they wish, hold rallies, collect donations, and function almost normally. They can even win a few seats in the legislative branch. However, because the ruling party has deliberately weaponized the functions of the government against them, the opposition will almost certainly never regain sufficient power through elections or the legal system to oppose the ruling party. One autocrat summed up how things go on after they seize power as, quote, they will make a fuss for a few days, and then they will calm down, and life will go on as usual. The average person uh, will never understand it. These states are totalitarian. These states are not totalitarian. The average person can criticize the government, but just not too loudly sometimes. There isn't 24/7 surveillance for thought crimes like there was in the old Soviet system. There are no gulags for political enemies, though the most meddlesome opponents of the regime are sometimes imprisoned on trumped-up charges. Protests occur, although sometimes they're assaulted by pro-government thugs and paramilitaries who do so with a wink and a nod from the police and the government. Most of the time, the government isn't going to waste time on these people because they understand protesters are powerless to actually make any change occur. Thus, for most people, living under competitive authoritarianism is both boring and stable. You know what's going to happen because nothing new is going to happen. But this stability comes at a cost. Stability is a hallmark of such regimes. Social scientists once believed that governments that were neither democratic nor authoritarian or totalitarian were weak and likely to collapse. This may have been true of developing nations during the Cold War, but has not been true since. There are now about 20 competitive autocracies today that have endured more than 15 years. Mostly right-wing, but I hasten to add, not truly conservative. They are something else. Most of these governments are right-wing, religiously conservative, xenophobic, and populist. They tend to frame everything as us versus them, the good, real, rural people against the urban elites. Immigrants and LGBTQ plus people, trans people in particular, as well as religious, racial, and ethnic minorities, Muslims, for example, tend to be scapegoated for all that ails the nation. The government promises to return to a mythic past when these sorts of people and tolerance against them were far scarcer. That's why the phrase like "Make America Great Again," the use of Confederate flags and swastikas and raised fists and so forth occur. Part of the us versus them philosophy is a seething hatred of cosmopolitan values. The ideology of most competitive authoritarian states is essentially fascist. It's an oft-repeated chapter in history books that we can't seem to recognize or stop until it's too late. Are we now following in the footsteps of competitive authoritarian governments like Russia and Hungary, and also Turkey to a great extent? Poland has reversed itself and gone the other way, fortunately, and maybe Brazil too. In his first term, Trump Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the GOP aggressively pursued filling vacancies on the court with unqualified ideologues, people who had no real deep legal training to be in the position that they were named to. Attacking the media, while Sinclair, Fox News, and conservative news outlets dominated the airwaves and social media. Reputable news sources were bankrupt, sued, moved behind paywalls, or intimidated into providing coverage that normalized anti-democratic actions by the administration. So there are advantages of an uneven playing field. For example, if we had a hypothetical example where killing a journalist or firing on crowds of protesters happened, that can easily rally international opinion and turn an autocrat into a pariah. But few notice or care if party supporters infiltrate the Electoral Commission or a pro-government entrepreneur uses government funds to take control over an opposition website. Think of Elon Musk, maybe, huh? Uh, and uh, and using the legal system to force out independent voices enables the government to argue that it has not abused power. We are hypnotized. When people think of authoritarian governments, they think of police states like the old Nazis and the old Stalinist communists and the 20th century totalitarianism. But authoritarianism is that mostly they do not transfer power through free and fair elections. Free and fair elections in this country are so important. Some governments, like China, are violently and nakedly repressive. Others control their population through subtler means. Competitive authoritarian governments fall into the latter category, so closely resembling a democracy on paper that many of their own citizens believe that they're still living in one. Think of the boiled frog syndrome. Are we all boiled frogs? Or are we going to leap out on our own before it's too late? Yes, in so many ways, we are, in fact, hypnotized. Incumbents abuse state resources, deny the opposition adequate media coverage, harass opposition candidates and their supporters, and in some cases manipulate electoral results. Yet competitive authoritarian systems survive by convincing citizens that we are living in a democracy. They maintain their legitimacy and prevent popular uprisings. As such, they do not conduct the obvious sham elections held in places like Bashar al-Assad's Syria. He won in 2021 with 95% of the vote. Now, I will point out it didn't do him any good in the end because he still got thrown out. But these sham elections just are a disgrace. In competitive authoritarianism, the opposition does have some ability to win a bit of power through competition, even if the scope of their possible victories are limited. They're not easy to create. It's a tricky balance for the regime to pull off, rigging elections enough to maintain power indefinitely while still permitting enough democracy that citizens don't rise up in outrage. Some competitive authoritarian regimes have collapsed under the stress either through transitioning to democracy, like Taiwan did, or forcefully repressing the opposition and becoming a more traditional autocracy, like Belarus has become. But many systems manage to survive. In 2020, Levitsky and Wei, another author who did some work in this area, found that 10 out of 35 competitive authoritarian regimes they identified in 2002 remained in place nearly 2 decades later, 20 years and more. And new ones had emerged in countries that had previously been seen as solidly democratic, most notably Hungary, which today is one of the most effective competitive authoritarian systems in the world. So too late to save. Happily, the United States still passes a most basic test of whether a system is democratic, whether the public can vote out its leaders. And may I also observe that one of the wise and wonderful things is that elections in this country are not federal. They are all conducted by each state in its own way. Now, there are some guidelines sometimes from the national government, but states run elections. And as such, the election process is done through volunteers, volunteers who are not co-opted by this system entirely. And so there is a considerable amount of division and independence in our elections in this country. It also helps that we are a federal system where the states have, in some ways, almost equal standing with the national government. It's hard to deny that the Republican Party has begun chipping away at the baseline principle, using the flaws in our political system to entrench their power. Republicans already have unfair structural advantages due to our outmoded Constitution. I say outmoded because it is structured so that it does not always represent the majority. And we can talk about that in a later presentation. But it's a great document, just that it's a little bit out of the date for our current time and is not, remember, premised on establishing democracy, but rather a representative government. The nature of the Electoral College means that the key battleground states, like Pennsylvania, for example, are considerably redder than the country as a whole. The Senate is also biased against dense urban states that under half of Americans control 82% of Senate seats. Under half of Americans control 82% of the Senate seats. The combination of anti-urban bias and international gerrymandering means that the GOP has had a leg up in House elections since 1968. The Republican Party builds on the inherent tendencies of the U.S. constitutional system towards minority rule to push us towards something more authoritarian. It combines intentional state-level election rigging with abuse of counter-majoritarian institutions like the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is 6-3 divided, and so it's not really evenly a majority. It's a distorted majority. The federal level are working to delegitimize the press and other non-state institutions. Some of these developments, like extreme gerrymandering and efforts to keep their supporters in a propaganda bubble, insulating from nonpartisan media, are long-running. There was one district in Illinois, District 4, which ran all the way across the southern part of Chicago and Cicero, and all the way out to the 294 corridor, where they had a thin line that connected it to another part of a district further north. It was extreme gerrymandering in order to accomplish a biased political goal. Many of the most concerning developments, ones that directly echo the approach of competitive authoritarian regimes abroad, are new in our country. We haven't thought about this before. So we ask, are these warning signs? In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's key power consolidating move was stacking the country's election administration aging with cronies from his Fidesz party, allowing the party to more easily rig the game in its favor. Another important Orban tactic has been abusing regulatory policy to punish businesses that threaten the party's hold on political power, going after your enemies. In the U.S. 2023 legislative cycle, 196 bills were identified in 39 states that would interfere with election administration. We tend to do what we can to make sure that the majority does not rule in this country. January 6th, just another day, and then, of course, there's a January 6th uprising and the Republican embrace of its fundamental premise that the 2020 election was somehow illegitimate. All competitive authoritarian regimes need ideological justification for anti-democratic policies and politics, something to rally its supporters against their enemies. The GOP has long employed nationalism, xenophobia, and a defense of traditional gender norms, but now is united around a more straightforward cause. American elections are corrupt, and Republican efforts to make elections unfair are actual efforts to fix them. The point here is not that the GOP's anti-democratic inclinations are completely new. In fact, they've evolved over decades. All of these things can trace their roots back to various proposals and activities from long, long ago. The Trump's presidency and the January 6th election forged into a competitive authoritarian agenda. Many consider the fall of the Berlin Wall as the beginning of a free world. The United States had won the Cold War. The idea was that all countries would embrace democracy. The internet would spread information and undermine dictatorships. These dreams have not come true. China has become a dominant power. The Arab Spring failed, and countries like Russia and Turkey have moved away from democracy And even in the West, a free media can no longer be taken for granted. Independent judiciaries are also under pressure, and while the internet did increase people's access to information, it has come with fake news and massive digital surveillance. Political scientists can help us understand what authoritarianism is and how it might relate to other tendencies such as populism or xenophobia. To understand authoritarianism, we need to look at more than elections. We must get away from seeing nations as separate units that are either democratic or authoritarian. Authoritarian practices can occur within democratic states by several states collaborating with the help of corporate actors. These authoritarian practices are about sabotaging accountability, and that's done in two major ways. The first is lying to the public or keeping secrets from them without a legitimate reason. The NASA, NASA, for example, helped by secret agencies in many countries, was snooping on millions of people. This was done with data obtained from the biggest tech companies. Their spying programs were repeatedly denied until this became impossible. The second way of sabotaging accountability is by disabling voice, even in democracies like India and Mexico, where journalists and activists are regularly found dead after criticizing those in power. And I worry that our tech companies have become so mega and large, and they are so abusive in so many ways, including what Elon Musk has done and some others. I'm one of those who favors breaking up some of these technology companies, just as we did with AT&T many years ago. Governments like Iran and Syria harass and try to shut up their critical voices even far beyond their borders. Through the internet, understanding authoritarianism as a practice allows us to understand how these practices function. It will always be there, we've always said. Oh, yes, we're not going to change. We're not going to lose our country. Nearly all living Americans grew up taking our democracy for granted. Until recently, at least, most of us believed and acted as if our constitutional system was unbreakable, no matter how recklessly our politicians behave. Americans are uneasy about our political system that threatens to go off the rails. We've had costly government shutdowns, and they threatened every year almost. Stolen Supreme Court seats, as in the Ginsburg seat that was effectively stolen. Impeachments, concerns about the fairness of elections. The election of a presidential candidate who condoned violence at rallies and who threatened to lock up his rival and who, as president, began to subvert the rule of law by defying congressional oversight and corrupting law enforcement agencies to protect his political allies and investigate his opponents. All bad, bad, bad behavior. In a survey by Public Agenda, 39% of Americans said they believed our democracy is in crisis, while 42% said it faces serious challenges. Only 15% said American democracy is doing well. What do you believe? Is our democracy doing well? Are we headed in the right path? Or is it time for us to be a little bit more serious so we're not like the boiled frog? So let me take you back to what I originally said. In the beginning, we were not a democracy. We were a Republican representative form of government. Democracy came along with Andrew Jackson, and then we had a weak executive of the 19th century. Congress ruled. Then, because the country became so complex and large, when we get into the 20th century, we needed and had a strong executive. It started with Teddy Roosevelt, and all of our presidents, to one extent or the other, have been strong executives. More recently, we've had a movement, a philosophy espoused, starting with Nixon, but mostly under Reagan, about the unitary executive, that even more power should be concentrated in the presidency at the cost of Congress. And there are then legal scholars who say, no, if we study originalism, what the founding fathers really intended, that's not really a legitimate way of looking at government. If we follow the unitary executive, we're going to for sure wind up with competitive authoritarianism in this country. And that's based substantially on patrimonialism, and I'll have a session just on patrimonialism coming up in a few weeks, which is based upon loyalism and cronyism. You'll reward only your friends. And inevitably, because you are rewarding and putting people in power who really have no background, no experience, no education, no training for the role that they're expected to lead, you're going to wind up with incompetence. And incompetence almost certainly will lead to corruption, and corruption in turn, and I don't know that there is any at this point, but there will be corruption, I guarantee you that. And that can lead to a decline of our nation, which is what I fear most. Now, it's hard to reverse all of this, but we need to pay attention to our elections, especially in 2026 and 2028. Well, as we all know, all good things must come to an end. And so that is the end of this presentation for today. But remembering always that the ensuring the future is up to all of us, that we need to stay engaged and make our own individual contributions. Oh, yes, and then one more thing. Remember to hit the subscribe and like buttons if you're watching this on YouTube so I can be encouraged to create more History by Lou just for you. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to being with you for the next presentation.